Welcome to Medicine and Health with Dr. Paul Anderson. This is a show about opening the often mysterious world of how doctors think and how science works. This program exists to educate and empower you, the listener. Now, here's your host, Dr. Paul.
And here we go. So today, post-COVID and post-COVID vaccine reactions. What are we seeing clinically out in the world? What's going on? And most importantly, what do we do about it? So let's jump right in there. So I put this out on the announcements that I do for things. And then I got a lot of feedback, beforehand from clinicians around North America who are dealing with these sort of things. And as I've said in the past, I have a rather large network of clinicians, certainly in North America, but also other countries that I can call on to see what's going on, what are you seeing in your, in the clinic, in the hospital, et cetera, and what are we doing about it, and how well is that going? So I want to kind of get into that and talk about a few things. Now, if you're listening live on Facebook or you're live on CTR Radio, which is my home base, that's what produces all of this that you see, or you're somewhere else like on a pod burner. We're on just about every podcast platform out there. So look for Medicine Health, Dr. Paul Anderson. You should find me. So thank you. Like, share, subscribe, all that stuff. When I say I'm going to post the notes, I'm going to post the links, etc., in the show notes, that will be on the YouTube platform. So we push all this over after we record it to YouTube. And it'll be on my YouTube, which is just DRA, like Dr. A online. And if you search Dr. A online, DRA online, you will find me there. And I'd love if you would subscribe, like, share, and all that stuff. We're gaining subscribers, and that's always great. So do all that stuff. So if you're looking for the links or the show notes, look on the YouTube channel. And then you go down below. If you're on your device, a small device, on the right-hand side, there's a little down arrow or a down V. Press on that. It opens up the description and all the links. If you're on your computer, go over to the left side where it says show more. It doesn't always look like a link, but you just click on the show more, those two words, and it will open up the same stuff, all of the links and the paper and all that stuff. So I will put everything up that I bring up here on there, should you desire to look at it. So I want to start out and look at what is happening in the world of COVID-related reactions. What are we seeing clinically that we're having to deal with? And I want to say up front, and I'll say it again, none of this is intended to push any particular agenda. This is not about being, pro-disease or pro-vaccine or anti-disease or anti-vaccine or anything like that. So please don't accuse me of that sort of thing. I am going to share things that I see from the research, and also things that I'm hearing from not just like, one doctor in one place or people I see, but people literally all over North America, and in some cases other parts of the world. And what are we seeing across a large number of patients? And I think that the important thing about that is I'm going to share information. And information, around COVID is always dangerous because we all have, kind of preconceived notions about what's real, what works, what happens, and what doesn't. And so when things change or when the data shifts over time, sometimes that's, sort of, oh, gee, I didn't realize that. So I'm just going to share those things. I'm going to start out with a little bit of look at the data. Where are we now? All that stuff. And then I really want to spend the bulk of the time looking at, okay, what are the problems we see, whether it's post-COVID or post-vaccine reaction, and what are ways to think about it, and what are ways to deal with those things? Okay, so that's my goal here today. So when we think about it, I will put in, I think, one of the first things I'll have there in the show notes will be some of the other YouTube podcasts on what to do, when you get COVID and all that. And with the new subvariants of Omicron going around through the US, If you didn't get Omicron when it was BA1 the first time, the BA2 family is working its way through the US. So, we all, vaccinated or not, we all have the opportunity to get that. The only upside there is it does build herd immunity. So we've got that going for us. We've got some other podcasts on there, just looking maybe at the science of B and T cell immunity and how we can do that, a little bit about vitamin D and nutrients and COVID. So those are going to be the first links that you see. And that's stuff we've already done. So if you want to go on my YouTube channel and look backwards, or you want to go on your pod burner and look backwards, you'll see all that stuff. But I'll certainly put the links in there. But kind of keeping up with what's happening earlier, and I look back, and it was just about 2 months ago, I shared some data from February from the Alberta, Canada, the province of Alberta, from their hospital system. And I put an updated link into that. But what Omicron took over for Delta, so you had wild type and then alpha and then, Delta and then some other twists and turns in the middle. And for those that don't recall my story, I had the original Wuhan strain in 2019. That was no fun at all because we didn't know what it was. That was part of the problem because I got it in China. And we had no idea, think back 2019, no one knew. So that sucked really bad. And then I got Omicron BA1 when it made its first trip here, and I did a thing about that. So I built up all sorts of immunity through a number of different means in that amount of time. But what we've seen since Omicron has taken over from Delta is an actual inversion of the normal curves that we saw before. So generally the curves that we saw before were hospitalizations were higher in unvaccinated people. And if you looked at the percentages, that unvaccinated people would be higher and vaccinated people would be lower. And that kind of carried us through Delta. And then as soon as that happened and Omicron switched over, remember what we saw as immune escape with Omicron breakthrough. And so we started to see actually more and more and more people with full vaccination getting Omicron because of a lot of reasons to do with how the vaccine is protecting and how Omicron does its thing and all of that. Well, I did update, and so you'll see the data and the links and stuff in there. But I think, and you all know here on this program, if you're listening and you're not looking at the video or you don't have video, I'm going to hold up a graphic, and my graphics are always really super high tech. This is a piece of paper I printed out, and I put the link in. But if you look here and you look at this side, the yellow line there is unvaccinated, and the blue line is vaccinated. So like I said, in Delta time period, unvax, really high hospitalization rate, vaccinated, low hospitalization rate. And then they flip. See these two little arrows I drew here. So now vaccinated have taken over as the highest percentage of hospitalized, and unvax are the lowest percentage of hospitalized. And I'll put the raw data in and the link to the raw data, but essentially it's about 77% in the Alberta hospital system are vaccinated either between 1, 2, or 3 doses. 3 doses is actually the highest percentage. It's almost 50% of the hospitalized are people with 3 doses. But 77% are vaccinated to some degree, and unvaccinated are 24%. The nice thing is that the gross numbers of hospitalized people is getting less and less and less. But my point here is that the vaccine and immune escape is going on whether we want it to or not. Now, you could also say, well, there's people like you that, had the original Wuhan strain or had, Alpha or Delta or something, and then they wound up getting, Omicron. So you had immune escape in, the previous things. Yeah, the immune escape happens across the board because that's what viruses do. Okay, so you can't get by without having immune escape when you have a pandemic virus. And as the virus evolves forward and it creates its new forms, it's going to escape most of the immunity at some point. Now, the only upside with the trajectory of this virus is we get into Omicron, and now we're past BA1 and moving into the BA2 subfamilies. What we have now is giant immune escape across the board. So if you haven't had, Omicron before, or if you're fully vaccinated, immune escape, the Omicron will probably infect you in one way or another. Now, what they're saying, which makes some sense, is that people, like me who had it twice, or, had a vaccine and then got it, or had a vaccine and got it twice, either way, any combination thereof is building up your natural immunity, building up herd immunity. The other benefit, as the virus is mutating, is it gets a lot easier to spread, but it's less deadly. So higher spread, less negative health benefit. So there's all that stuff. So that'll be in there. I just wanted to update that because I've shared that data before, and it seems to be holding up through Omicron, that we have this flip now where more vaccinated or hospitalized, whereas during Delta and prior, it was exactly the opposite. So there's that. Now, there's another thing, and it's interesting just to kind of compare the science that gets published and then just what people say. Okay. So if for instance, and I'm not, but for instance, if I worked for, a state government or federal government or provincial government or whatever, or I worked for, the CDC or somebody like that, and I were to, just make a statement, there's a assumption that the statement that I'm making has some kind of science behind it. Okay. And what happens is a lot of times inferential statements that maybe officials make are taken by, a writer or a broadcaster or something, and they think, well, that's a pretty official person, or they publish it on their website, the government website. So I won't check their references, or maybe there weren't any references. So statements get made and then they sort of get regurgitated out to the public, which is fine. That happens all the time. But one of the statements that I was seeing that I thought, well, this doesn't really match some of this more recent science, there's a number of things like that in science, is when we talk about post-COVID syndrome, there's a lot of statements, especially in the popular media, that say, if you are vaccinated, you are protected to a large degree from post-COVID syndrome. And so I did a quick review and looked at the more recent papers and said, is that true? Who knows? It sounds good. Sounds like, well, if I was vaccinated, I'd be less likely to get post-COVID syndrome if I had a breakthrough infection, which now we're having tons of breakthrough. Well, there's a very recent March 9th, 2022. So if you're listening live, this is April 21st, 2022. So March 9th is just about the most recent publication stuff that we have. And it's Journal of General Internal Medicine, Association of Vaccination with the Persistence of Post-COVID Symptoms. So I thought, well, okay, so they're looking here. And the important thing is this is really looking at, the end of Delta and the beginning of Omicron. So this is very recent, retrospective data that these guys were looking at. And I'll put the reference in there for you so you'll have it. So the first thing is the p-value of their data was nice and low, 0.05. And the p-value means that the likelihood of the question they're asking being a real question in the research is very high. So it's not just sort of a random chance thing. So that's good. And the number of people they looked at was certainly in the hundreds. And basically what they look at was post-acute sequelae of COVID is the acronym they use, PASC, and that's just post-COVID syndrome. And when they looked backwards between baseline diagnosis of getting COVID, even though you're vaccinated, or the unvaccinated group, and then a 6-month visit, they were looking at symptoms, et cetera. And 72% of those with post-acute COVID or post-COVID syndrome, we'll just keep it easy, 72% were vaccinated. And then the balance, so 28% roughly were unvaccinated. And it's the same post-COVID symptoms that we see all the time, anosmia, so smell changes, taste changes, respiratory symptoms, anxiety, depression, PTSD, quality of life decrease, fatigue, those things. Okay. And the other thing was that they looked at, and you can read the whole paper if you want to, but they looked at other factors, and there was still, it was about 3/4 were vaccinated and 1/4 weren't. So, I know that there's some older data that sort of inferred, based on really early looking at and with some interesting sort of statistics that, well, if you're vaccinated, you just, you probably won't get any post-COVID. But that's just not the way it's turning out. And so the papers that I will give you reference to don't show it. But also, if I talk to clinicians as time goes on, and I talk to the patients, that I either consult with or consult with their doctors, it's just not fun. That's just not what's happening. So, and I don't mean that to say that, everything that you read that comes from the CDC or some government agency is made up, but it's just sort of, that's the folklore that we've all been talking about and saying, and it's starting to really not match the science. The other thing is that's not matching the science is what I just said earlier, and that is that, well, if you're vaccinated, you're not going to have to go to the hospital if you get COVID, and that's actually not matching the science either. So just some updates there. But what I want to do now is get into, well, what are clinicians reporting, and what are we seeing in the world of post-COVID and post-vaccine illness? And most importantly with that is not who's at fault. So it's the disease or the vaccine or whatever. It's that it is happening. And so what are we going to do about it? What we do about it, to me, is the most important thing. I do not think that it does any of us any good, except maybe to raise your blood pressure and all that, to try and argue, point A or point B or whatever, because the facts are that these things are happening. Now, people will say, well, post-vaccine illness is a very rare thing. And what we know is, if we look at the data that came out early in vaccination, of course, it's a smaller number of people and it's a rare thing. And then there's the whole thing where, remember, they had Pfizer release, all of their data that they didn't want to release for whatever it was, like 50 years or something. And they said, well, we were having more reactions than we talked about. Well, then people say, well, it's still pretty rare. And even the people that I'm going to cite in the references, they say, well, we're finding this, but it's probably still pretty rare. Well, here's the problem. I don't give a shit if it's rare or kind of rare or not very rare or whatever, for the most part. What I'm concerned about is we now have humans developing problems, and whether we want to believe it's from X or Y, they're developing problems. So we have people with COVID who get the disease and have post-COVID illness. That is a human problem we got to deal with. We have people who are getting the vaccine, and even if the vaccine's the best thing in the universe, it still has post-vaccine side effects that we're now seeing. The longer we get out and the more people we vaccinate, the more of these things that we see. And so I have references listed in there for both post-COVID and post-vaccine things that are going on. But I just want to kind of go through the what's happening there. And then I want to, take the second 2/3 of the program and really talk about what are things that we can be looking at, medically speaking, and also prevention wise, if that's even possible, that would be helpful if we have a reaction, whether it's to the disease, COVID, the vaccine, a little combination of both. Who cares? We got people with problems. Let's figure out a way to take care of them. And what I'm seeing more and more is that people are having a variety of responses to post-X syndrome. So whether it's post-COVID, post-Vax, whatever. And so many people don't get it, don't have it. But those who do either have a small, medium, or large problem. People who have kind of a small problem, usually it's self-correcting. It's just time and maybe other basic things take care of it. People with a medium-sized problem sometimes need some interventional help and then it goes away. The people I'm mostly concerned about are people with the big problem, the large-size problem with post-COVID, because they're going to be the people that have longer term effects, whether it's from vaccine or from COVID, the disease. And they're going to take more medical intervention to tease out, what do we do about your problem now? And what do we do to fix it? What do we do to diagnose it, et cetera? Okay. So let's kind of jump into that. So first, in post-COVID, so let's call that post-disease, right? So there may or may not have been a vaccine before. We already see from the data I just showed that vaccines don't protect you from post-COVID like a lot of people write about. That just doesn't follow the science at all. So there you go. Who cares? That's just the way it is. So post-COVID, whether you had a vaccine or not, post-COVID illness, you got fatigue, you've got a lot of neurological problems like trouble with taste and smell, you've got clotting issues, you've got potential problems with organ systems. So the neurological things are your nervous system, but also you could have cardiopulmonary problems. Now, one of the things with Omicron is there was less nasty pulmonary damage that we saw with the earlier versions. But there's other things that can happen. You could have some, heart or lung problems. Okay. You have some kidney things, clotting, as I mentioned, and many other things. The other thing, as the previous study was talking about, you wind up with a lot of, what they would consider, say, psychosocial issues that go on, because you get a lot of confusion in your interaction with medicine and your interaction with your doctors. And it's not that I am one of those doctors. It's not that doctors are trying to confuse you or confuse the case. This idea of post-COVID is fairly new. Post-viral illness is not new. That's been around for a very long time. But what I will tell you, as someone who treats a lot of post-viral illness patients, post-viral illness is not a common thing treated en masse throughout medicine. So when you look at post-viral illness, yes, we've known about a long time. Now we just have this pandemic where we've got more people sick and we got more people with post-viral illness due to COVID. And so something that the largest group of medical providers never treated before, suddenly now they're being presented with and saying, what do we do about this? Now, what happens, and this is what I hear from a lot of patients that, send in comments and stuff, is, well, I've got post-COVID, or I've got a post-vaccine reaction. I'm being referred now to, cardiologist and pulmonologist and other, other medical specialties, which is great because there might be specific diagnostic things they need to do, but there isn't a lot of coordinated treatment. And unless that person has maybe a primary care provider who's doing all these referrals, who's really into, post-viral or post-vaccine treatment, they're just going to refer that patient out and hope that one of the specialists does something about it. Well, that's not how specialties work in North America. You refer somebody out to a specialist, they have a specialist job to do. They have diagnosis and intervention if they find something. Now, they may find global general sort of things, but for instance, the cardiologist is usually not going to be treating things not related to the cardiopulmonary system, because that's not what they're there for. So we kind of have this disconnect in the way that North American medicine is done anyway. So I want to talk about how do we get past that, or how do we at least think about it. The other thing is, and I've got, let's see, 4 papers linked here just to kind of give you a flavor for this. There's a lot of post-vaccine things that you can see. Some are, like with post-COVID, clotting issues, myocarditis, other things like that, so cardiovascular type things. There's also a lot which is related to the cardiovascular things, but more body global. New onset or aggravation of previous onset autoimmune conditions. Now, I've talked about autoimmunity on the program here a lot. And basically, autoimmunity is where you have a part of your body and your immune system has decided that piece is not part of you, and we're going to attack it constantly. And as you might imagine, that's never a great idea for you, right? So if you have autoimmunity, your immune system is literally targeted towards you or a piece of you, okay? So in an autoimmune phenomenon, your body's immune system is turned on against part of you. Now, as I've talked about in the other programs, you can go and look at them if you want a deep dive, but autoimmunity can be triggered by anything that aggravates the cells. So if you imagine, let's say you had normal cells here and you get a toxic chemical in and on the cell, or you get a virus inside the cell, or you get a kind of a foreign looking protein that goes and sticks on the cell, or some other thing. That's a really good way to trigger an autoimmune phenomenon. So in some of the reviews, and this is not encyclopedic, I just put 4 in there, what we're seeing a lot with the post-vaccine world, beyond cardiovascular problems, which are sort of the big name brand things that we're seeing now, is production of autoantibodies and flaring of autoimmunity, or even new autoimmunity coming along. And so, like I said, early on, everyone was saying, well, this is extremely rare, almost never happens. Then a little bit later, it was like, well, it maybe happens a little bit, but it's still less than getting COVID, and now we're getting more and more publications in the peer-reviewed medical literature that say it may still be rare, but we're seeing it a lot more. And here's what we're seeing. We're seeing clusters of autoimmunity. We're seeing heart inflammation. We're seeing blood vessel inflammation. We're seeing all this stuff. And so the papers being published just keep coming out about post-vaccine problems. And like I said, whether it's post-COVID or post-vaccine, at the point that you, the human, have a problem, it doesn't matter how it came or how it got there. There are bigger issues around that, risk and benefit issues. And as I always say on here, I'm not here to tell you what to do with your medical care. I'm giving you information, but your medical care is between your healthcare providers and you should have, good, frank conversations about that. So, if a treatment is good for you, or if whatever, you're going to do is good for you, that should be not between you and the media, not between you and people like me on, YouTube or the radio, and not between you and anybody else other than your healthcare providers and you. So, but it should be based in reality and based in, a lot of good questions and to and fro with you and the healthcare providers. So as we're going along here, we've got this concept that it doesn't matter how we started with the problems, we now have problems. So are there big picture and then little picture things that we can look at that number one, kind of set our expectations as far as what's going to be required in the world of treatment and assessment and all of that, but also how is this looking as far as length of time to treat or to deal with these post-illness problems. So as we move into that, then what I'm going to talk about essentially is I'm going to do some specific things to, COVID, the infection, and maybe a couple of things here. I can't remember. I'll look at my notes, but a couple of things to, post-vaccine. But really what we're seeing is post anything, whether it's natural infection or vaccine, we got people with problems. And so what do we do about them? How bad are they? And what do we do about them? And it doesn't matter if it's, 5 people or 5 million people. Any amount of humans who are suffering and who are having problems, we have to deal with that. And so, there's sort of a misnomer in some people's minds, or you read some articles that like, well, these side effects are very rare and you'll never see them. Well, as I said, now they're being published, almost daily in multiple journals, side effects from the vaccine or post-COVID things or whatever. So it's not just a few people. It's going to be more and more as time goes on. So that is the way it is. So let's just deal with reality. The first bit of reality that nobody wants to hear, but that I have seen over and over, and as I talk to clinicians around the world, matches, is literally that if you remember, I said there's small, medium, and large versions of either post-COVID or post-vaccine problems. If you have a small version, it's usually self-limited, goes away on its own. If you have a medium version, it might last a little while. You might need a little bit of intervention, but then it goes away. That's not what we're going to talk about today. What I want to talk about is the large version, and that's what people who've had post-COVID illness for 2 months to 2 years are talking about. That's what people who have post-vaccine effects that are autoimmune or inflammatory or cardiopulmonary or whatever. That's the large ones that we're talking about here. So the first thing that you have to understand is once you have a large problem, so not talking about small or medium, but large problem, it's going to take a lot longer than you think to resolve. Okay, number one. Number two, if you do not at some point, either through your own efforts or through the efforts of usually a group of healthcare providers, take a kind of a top-down constitutional approach to looking at your problem, you will kind of play whack-a-mole and you'll attack this thing that the one doctor finds and that'll get better for a while and then it'll stop helping. And then you attack this thing over here, another doctor finds, or maybe you got a doctor that keeps looking and they find X and then Y and then Z, and you keep kind of whacking away at them and you kind of don't get a lot of progress. You have to look at yourself as a whole entity. And although we have different organ systems, a problem in my immune system affects everything. A problem in my cardiovascular system affects everything eventually. Problem in my nervous system can affect everything. Problem with my digestive system. So we have to think of the fact that while we may find some, what I call the things that stick up above the water, may find big problems like you reactivated an infection or, you got autoimmunity turned on or something. Cool, we get to deal with those things. The rest of you needs help too. So a constitutional approach, meaning a whole person approach, is the way. If you have a large scale problem, remember, I'm not talking about small or medium, I'm talking about large scale problems, because I have people that comment and I know what they mean, and they say, look, all I did was rest extra and I drank extra water and I did fine. I had no post-COVID. Great, wonderful, bless you. That I'm not talking to that group of people. Okay, they are better now. Okay, I'm not talking to the people who had one problem and COVID deranged their thyroid and they got their thyroid fixed and they're all better now. Fine, great. I am so happy for you. I'm not talking to you. I'm talking to the people who are a growing number of people, whether it's post-COVID or post-vaccine, that have big problems that are not going away or not going away very quickly. So having a constitutional approach is very, very important. Looking at your whole body, we're going to get into that. The next thing is it's going to take way longer than you think if you have a large problem. Small, medium, no. Large problem, yes. So the autoimmune deregulation that we're seeing from post-vaccine and the inflammatory deregulation that we see post-COVID and post-vaccine, 6 months is a short amount of time. 1 to 2 years, not uncommon to get that genie back in the bottle. We see people who have recovered, from COVID, but their inflammatory markers are still just crazy and all over the map. And they look like, somebody who's been sick for years and years or has end-stage cancer or something. So these things are a big problem, okay? So everything's going to take longer. If you have especially developed an upswing in autoimmunity, whether it's from post-COVID disease or post-vaccine, and with post-vaccine, that's one of the big areas we're seeing being published about is post-vaccine autoimmunity, but you also get it with post-COVID. If you've developed autoimmunity, so attack against yourself, whether it's a limited thing like Hashimoto's thyroiditis, or you've aggravated your psoriatic arthritis or your rheumatoid arthritis, or maybe you have a bunch of autoimmune things, your ANA's gone up and a bunch of areas are auto-inflamed, that is a slow thing to kind of rewind, to get the genie back in the bottle. So a lot of people are, on things that would normally, under normal non-COVID and non-vaccine circumstances, kind of push everything back down and level the ship out. And 3 to 6 months, you'd start to see a lot of positive effect. A lot of those people are doing all those things, and they're, 3 to 6 months out, and they're having very little effect. Now, it doesn't mean that the things aren't working. It means that the things are working very slowly. The other thing is that let's say you've got an autoimmune issue. If there are other problems below the surface that you haven't unearthed, that is just going to continue like a hole in the bucket to drain the energy out. So that's got to be dealt with. The other thing that's really frustrating is, and you can't go back and undo things, but in the case of COVID illness, so you get COVID as a disease, what we've seen in a group that I communicate with who are all people treating COVID patients is early treatment, which is something that everyone was, scared to talk about. And, there's even certain jurisdictions where we're told not to speak about, early treatment of COVID, because that would create vaccine hesitancy and blah, 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 whatever. Here's the bottom line. There's a group that I monitor and I'm part of, and when we hit about 4,000 patients, what we saw was that early treatment of COVID led to almost no hospitalization and death, but also, and there were some, but very few, and it also led to an extremely low percentage of post-COVID illness. Now, if you want to look at early treatment of COVID, go back and look at the 2 videos of my COVID experience and other stuff like that. I don't have time to get into that here. But if you do get COVID or a loved one gets COVID, early treatment, and I'm not talking about going to the hospital, as you want to early treatment yourself so you never have to go to the hospital. That's the worst step you can take. Now, sometimes you have to go to the hospital, but as far as the COVID journey goes, stay out, okay? Early treatment deals with all of the other things. And as I said, there's previous videos on that. But let's say the horse is out of the barn and you've had COVID and now you got a big, small, medium, or large, you got a large post-COVID problem, or you have vaccine and COVID. Now you get small, medium, or large, you got a big post-vax problem. Well, what's a way to look at it? What do we do? So the things to consider, although these things are going to go very slowly, is that we have to look at the main critical areas. If we look at our body as a whole and look at us constitutionally, we have to look at all of the areas that can go wrong in the body. One of the things I find for both patients and physicians when I speak to both groups that is so mystifying, and it's logically mystifying because it doesn't make any sense, is that um, things that could have been totally normal and you've never had a disease process in the area before are suddenly a new problem. COVID and even the vaccine immunoregulatory issues, if you get those, are what I call the great unmaskers. So the post-COVID, post-vaccine life, it can, what I could call turn over rocks, and underneath there can be pathology that you never knew you had before. That doesn't make sense to anyone. Well, the reasons for that are many. And if you look and you go back to some previous things, just in the world of like co-infections with COVID, COVID both allows in and also activates a lot of chronic infectious problems. And in one of my prior videos, I gave, just the quick and dirty on all the publications around that. Is like, 30 or 35 publications, and they're growing all the time. Well, in that respect, these are things that people are not even looking for medically because we don't think that that's even possible. The other thing we see is people, who have something that was calmed down, autoimmunity, toxic exposure, whatever, get COVID or vaccine or whatever, have a large scale reaction. So not small, medium, but large scale reaction. And suddenly what was all healed up before is no longer healed up. So what areas do we look at? What things can we take a step back and say, and to be quite honest, in the world, in the way that we practice medicine in North America, certainly, if your primary care is doing the best job they can, they're going to refer you to specialists. If you have, X problem, you're going to go to X type specialist. Y problem, Y type specialist. They might send you to 3 different ones. So get as much as you can out of that, but you may actually have to quarterback your own thought process and, assessment and care as you look into things. Now, these don't go in any particular order because we're all one system and there's nothing really more important. You can't take most things out of your body and still live with them. So these don't go in any order other than the way I wrote them down. The first thing as a target to think about is cell function. And so cell function includes the ability of nutrients to get into your cells and oxygen and goodies, and the ability of your cell to eliminate carbon dioxide and toxins and secondary metabolites and things like that. Your cells are incredibly complex and they do a lot of stuff, and they take marching orders from hormones and other things. And it's easy for them when your body has been inflamed or autoimmune or some combination of everything for them to, not run very well. Now, cells generally don't just stop working, because if you have enough stop working, you get a big pathology or you die. But they will turn themselves down through many means. So nutrition, turnover of oxygen, those are all important things to look at. And your nutrition is largely your responsibility. So looking at those things, and I've got other videos on deeper ideas about that. Function of your cell parts, the organelles like your mitochondria can slow down, and other stuff that doesn't work. But then there's other things like your genomics, especially where nutrition and genomics come together. We call it nutrigenomics. There are things that epigenetically get turned on as pathologies nutrigenomically that you didn't have before. So people say, well, if they're the same genes that I had before I had the vaccine or COVID, why are they giving me problems now? Well, it's because you need an epigenetic signal. So genes are the code, and epigenetic signal turns on or off the code. And COVID infection, vaccine reaction, those are all really good epigenetic triggers to turn on problems that you didn't know you had. And deep within our genomics, our code, are a lot of things that we don't have problems with until we have enough stressors in our life and on our body to turn them on. So there are nutrigenetic or nutrigenomic assessments that can be done to look at those areas. And then there's things like your cell membranes. They can get inflamed if you have a lot of autoimmune issues or a lot of inflammatory stuff. That can become a problem. The next area that, again, doesn't go in any particular order, but is a resistance factors, essentially. So this is things like biofilms. Biofilms build up the sicker you are. So you could have no big biofilm problems, and they largely, exist in your GI tract. And then we have a lot of non-pathological biofilms as part of us. But then you can look forward and you can see that as the inflammation from being sick or inflammation of post-vaccine or whatever goes on, that can trigger pathogenic biofilm. So that's a resistance factor. But other resistance factors are pre-existing immunologic problems, so autoimmunity, chronic infections, other stuff like that. Also, drugs, medications you might be on that are immunosuppressive. And there's a lot of immunosuppressive drugs. So if you go into, you're feeling pretty healthy, but you go into the disease and your body develops resistance factors on its own, like biofilms, or it is exposed to, immunosuppressive drugs or whatever, those become a big problem because they magnify other issues. And some of the other issues are the next area, which is your immunology. So your immune system is wonderful, and it generally keeps you from getting sick. If you didn't have a functional immune system, you'd be dead. So that's wonderful. But your immune system take a big hit with post-COVID and post-vaccine issues. So when we look at these in people, there's groupings of things in the immune system area that have to be looked at. The first we've talked about is autoimmunity, and that at least can be screened with blood tests when they're looking at things. And like I said earlier, this is a little flummoxing to the healthcare providers because we're not thinking that somebody who we saw last year and had no autoimmune problem would suddenly be having an autoimmune problem. It's a little easier if you already had an autoimmune. So you already had Hashimoto's, or you already had rheumatoid arthritis or psoriatic arthritis or Crohn's or colitis or whatever, and we see a flare up there, we're going to retest those things and say, gee, you've had a flare up, and maybe this intervention in your life, whether it's COVID or post-vax, has created it. But at that point, it doesn't matter what the intervention was, you got this problem. Well, autoimmunity can be de novo, it can be new after both of these problems, as the papers that I shared show. But the next thing then would be immune deficiencies. There's a lot of people that have borderline immune deficiencies that only show up when they get really sick, or they get an immunologic shift, like a vaccine reaction. And so that's very possible, and that those things can be tested for. Then there's, acute and chronic infections. So you think, well, it's, I had COVID or I had this reaction to the vaccine or whatever. Isn't that bad enough? Yeah, probably bad enough. But the problem is, doesn't matter whether that's bad enough or not. And this is something that goes back to a prior show where I put all of those references into the show notes there on YouTube. COVID has a way of turning back on a lot of chronic infections, but also the infection or the post-immunologic problems that occur with vaccine reactions. Both can open the door to infections that you wouldn't have gotten any other way. And a lot of these are chronic infections. So you have to look for those things. So these immunologic things, it's like when we get somebody, not small, medium, but in a large problem with post-COVID or post-vax, we really do have to start from zero and check them for baseline autoimmune problems, check their immunology to see if their B cells are working correctly. A little bit you can test with their T cells, taking a look if they really have a big scale problem at chronic infections, and then some of the things that can be run under the radar, like adult streptococcal illness and stuff like that. So all of it really needs to be looked at. There's another part of immunology that we hear a lot about with respect to post-COVID and post-vaccine problems. And that has to do with vessel inflammation and clotting problems. So one of the things that we see with clotting is you do have to test these things to see, what's good and bad. But there's differences in the way that you can intervene with blood vessel inflammation and clotting. So if you're in the hospital, you might get a drug called heparin, whether plain or low molecular weight heparin, and that is intended to keep your blood from clotting, but it works up through a antithrombin manipulation, which is kind of high, medium in the clotting cascade. Those other things that we do or give you to stop you from clotting. So there's the phospholipase targeted drugs like aspirin and Plavix, things of that nature. Then there's membrane targeted things like the vitamin E. Vitamin E is a membrane target that hangs out in the membranes, especially around your thrombocytes, and keeps them from getting inflamed and sticky and sticking together. And then there are proteolytic enzyme therapies that are done. So you hear about things like, nattokinase, lumbrokinase, serrapeptidase, things of that nature. And these are enzyme therapies that also help, but they all help in different ways. So a lot of times we have somebody with an immunologic clotting problem, it may not go away quickly. And we see this both with post-COVID and post-vaccine reactions where they're just more prone to clotting. We don't want that. We don't want you to have a stroke. We don't want you to have, clotting in your lungs or your kidneys or really anywhere else that you shouldn't. So sometimes there might be a multifaceted approach to lowering the clotting, and the clotting issues can take months to go away. So if it's a real high-grade problem, the person might be on low molecular weight heparin and and a Plavix and maybe a proteolytic enzyme. If it's not at that level, they might still be on aspirin for a while, and then enzyme therapy and vitamin E and maybe some other things that go on. So you don't want to leave clotting out as an immunologic problem. The next area, of course, is your hormone system. And this is even if you've never had a problem before. Hormone dysregulation is very common post either of these issues we're talking about. So you have to have your, thyroid looked at on a number of levels, both from thyroid resistance and standard thyroid stuff, at least checking a screening of your adrenal output. Cortisol can either be high or low post these things. And then the reproductive hormones are sometimes involved. Then another area, if we're looking at ourselves constitutionally, is psychosocial. And a lot of this is, there's a lot of times where we get into situations where we're sick, our doctors are trying their best, but we're not getting a lot of answers. And so you start to feel kind of left out or even gaslit, like, well, this is an emotional problem. Well, no, the psychosocial aspects can be huge. And if you're the only person sick in your family, you feel isolated. If you're the only person sick at your company, whatever. So you start to kind of second guess yourself. Other areas in the last few minutes that we want to keep as we look constitutionally at ourselves are digestive issues. Digestive inflammation is very big. It can be triggered by both of the events we've talked about, either post-COVID or post-vaccine. But also your GI membrane health is a big thing, your ability to absorb nutrients, et cetera. And then the last is structural, physical and structural. I've done a lot, mostly over on my TikTok, because that's shorter. You can go look over there on my TikTok. But I've done a lot with, physical repair after having COVID. So I, had COVID twice. Last time, I treated it very aggressively early on. I have no post-COVID. But one thing I had to do is physically get my body working again. I chose to do that with body workers, with me physically exercising. And I've got a really good chiropractor that I work with, but you may have other ways to do that. but the physical and structural things can get really, sort of either slowed down or not very with it after you're sick in either of these ways. So we're just about out of time. What I want to leave you with is, number one, if you're looking for these references in the show notes, go to the YouTube channel, like, share, and subscribe on any of the platforms, please. But YouTube is where I'll have it. It'll be down in the description box. If it's on your device, lower right corner, little arrow down, click on that. It'll open up. If you're on your laptop, lower left corner, the Show More tab, and that's the same tab as the other one on your little device. And you'll open it up, and basically I have these notes with all these links and stuff. I'll just put those right up on there, and you can go read about all this stuff yourself. Because really, you should take all of us people who are talking heads and, listen and see what you think, and then do your own digging. Look into it for yourself. But anyway, I'm Dr. Paul Anderson. This is Medicine and Health with Dr. Paul Anderson. And this week we're talking about post-COVID and post-vaccine effects, what we're seeing, what the data shows, what the clinicians are talking about, which is usually a little ahead of the data. But then our last half of the program was really, where do you want to go looking? What do you want to be thinking about when you think of yourself constitutionally or as a whole body, as a holistic person? When you get sick with these things, they affect more than you would imagine. All right, that's it for today on Medicine and Health. I'll see you all on the radio next week. Hope you have a good day.